Winston Churchill told his private secretary a few years after the Second World War ended, "No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt." Churchill was thinking of the world's most well-known transatlantic partnership. Churchill's portrayal and the general public's perception of it both point to a golden age of cooperation. The courage and eloquence of a struggling prime minister entices a forward-thinking American president to come to his aid. This optimistic view, however, is mostly a fallacy. In actuality, a brutal psychological battle marked the beginning of the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, the two great leaders of 20th century democracy. It coincided with the parallel conflict between Hitler and Stalin, the two totalitarian tyrants of the 20th century, which resulted in the Nazi invasion of Russia. It was rife with mistrust, deception, and avoidance, much like the dictators' battle. Even as the two men got closer, it was clear that their long-term goals were very different. The seeds of resentful disillusionment and dispute about how to release hundreds of millions of people were planted there. On a sunny spring morning in Washington on May 10, 1940, President Roosevelt convened a cabinet meeting to discuss startling news from Europe. Nazi troops were crashing into Belgium, Holland, and France. There was political unrest in Britain. A key figure in Roosevelt's administration was American Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. We learned of Chamberlain's resignation when we were at cabinet. Even though he was intoxicated half the time, the president said he assumed that Churchill was the greatest man England had. Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom that evening. He informed his son Randolph a few days later that defeating Hitler could only be accomplished in one way. "I'll bring the United States in." Churchill had no idea that his whole plan to win the war hinged on wooing a guy who not only viewed him as a drunk but also harbored animosity toward him that dated back more than 2 decades. That distaste sprang from Roosevelt's recollection of the one and only in-person encounter he had ever had with Churchill. Before becoming crippled, he had been to Britain and France in 1918 while serving as the American Navy's undersecretary. He later said that Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty in Britain at the time, had been a jerk and had dominated us. Since then, the two men had not seen one another, and they seemed to be complete opposites in the 10 years preceding World War II. Churchill, who has been stranded in the political wilderness, and Roosevelt, the charismatic president. Churchill was a staunch supporter of the British Empire, while Roosevelt was the scourge of European colonialism, but they were bound together by something. From the beginning, they both saw that Hitler had introduced a new and dreadful force that would make peaceful cohabitation impossible. Roosevelt thus initiated a transatlantic cable contact with Churchill as soon as he returned to the cabinet as the First Lord of the Admiralty on the commencement of war. "My dear Churchill, I want you to know how happy I am to see you again in the Admiralty, because we held similar roles during the World War. I have always disliked him since the time I went to England in 1918, Roosevelt said in private to Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador to Britain. He has a good chance of becoming Prime Minister. Therefore, I'm paying attention to him right now because I want to get my hands on him." These men had very little in common, and their relationship was first put to the test during Hitler's Blitzkrieg. Churchill's initial strategy was to try to scare Roosevelt into assisting France and Britain. May 15th. The scene has quickly grown darker. "I hope you understand, Mr. President, that if the United States' voice and force are suppressed for too long, they might be ineffective. With startling speed, you might have a Naziized, totally subdued Europe." Churchill informed Roosevelt that the immediate loan of 50 American destroyers, which had been put on hold since World War I, could be crucial to Britain's survival. Roosevelt turned him down the following day. Churchill had been immediately disappointed by his initial request. However, the loan posed too much of a political risk for the president. The United States was still a peaceful country that was subject to neutrality laws and attempting to enjoy life. 3 weeks later, Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, joined the conflict. Mussolini had been asked to stay out by Roosevelt. He was angry that evening. The hand that had the dagger hit its neighbor in the back on this 10th day. Roosevelt pledged to provide France and Britain with prompt, useful assistance. The material resources of this country will be extended to those who oppose the use of force. John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, wrote in his diary that he was ecstatic. The president appeared to be going to deliver this time. On June 12, 1940, at any rate, Winston seems to be hoping that America will enter as a non-combative ally at this time. Roosevelt even followed up with a confidential communication to Churchill and French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, reaffirming his pledge to assist, as Paris readied itself for the Nazi invasion and its children were evacuated. This government is making every effort to provide the supplies that the Allied governments so desperately need. Churchill took advantage of Roosevelt's pledge. June 15th. We must request reinforcement with these destroyers since it is a question of life and death. Even though the odds are against us, we will continue to fight, even though it could be beyond our means, unless we get every piece of support. However, France turned itself into the Nazis on June 17th. Roosevelt thought that Britain may collapse as well. Attempting to save a man who was drowning proved futile. He slammed the door shut just days after promising assistance. June 19th, President R. has rejected our request for 40 destroyers. We are in dire need of them. Churchill suffered a devastating blow during this first battle of their conflict. In actuality, he was fooling himself by believing, even for a brief moment, that Roosevelt could have made any announcement at that point that would have committed Americans to the possibility of war. The material resources of this country will be extended to those who oppose the use of force. Roosevelt, however, had made a clear commitment to assist. It ought to have served as a warning. Both public and private statements made by the president could not be believed, as at the end of June 1940, Churchill was alone. Europe was ruled by Hitler. Roosevelt had failed to deliver on his pledges of assistance. But many Americans had to reconsider after being shocked by Hitler's conquests. According to polls, the percentage of people who would support Britain, even if it meant enlisting the U.S. in the conflict, increased from 30% to 60%. Roosevelt could also tell that Churchill and the British were determined to fight to the finish. Churchill requested the loan of America's World War I destroyers once more in light of these altered conditions. With the utmost respect, Mr. President, I must inform you that this is something that needs to be done now in the world's lengthy history. Roosevelt answered yes this time, on far more secure political ground. However, he insisted on a formal arrangement that would provide America 99-year leases on military bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland in exchange for the destroyers in order to appease the U.S. Congress. Although Churchill was not opposed to the Americans owning the bases, he felt humiliated that it should be presented as a deal. Empires simply don't haggle, he said in a telephone conversation with Robert Jackson, the U.S. Attorney General, across the Atlantic. And republics do, Jackson said. It was Churchill's cherished empire's first minor setback. However, the morale and value were invaluable. He was ecstatic when he announced the destroyer contract to the House of Commons. Let it roll on. The Prime Minister concluded his speech on August 20th by drawing a comparison between the Missouri River and Anglo-American collaboration, which he said will eventually lead to union. He sung an unintelligible rendition of Old Man River when we were driving back to Downing Street. The fall of 1940 solidified Roosevelt's belief that Churchill was deserving of support. During the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force defeated the Luftwaffe. Plans for Hitler's invasion were shelved. Churchill's intimate associates, including his private secretary John Colville and War Secretary Anthony Eden, could watch him start to unwind. On Tuesday, October 8, 1940, Eden and the PM had dinner in his new dining room at Num. 10 when the PM was wearing his blue siren costume. He was in excellent shape and delighted Eden and me with his chat with Nelson, the black cat, which he reprimanded for being unworthy of his name and terrified of the guns. Try to remember what those boys in the RAF are doing, he remarked sternly to Nelson. Churchill had thus far only been able to issue dire warnings to Roosevelt. Now that Hitler had been temporarily stopped, he could also show Roosevelt his lighter side. I don't think the threat of invasion has passed. The water is growing cooler and there's a hint of autumn in the air. But the man has stripped off his clothing and changed into his bathing suit. But the harsh reality was that Churchill was more in need of Roosevelt than ever. Britain was going bankrupt from the war against Hitler by the end of 1940. Churchill begged for significant American assistance. He wrote Roosevelt a lengthy message that contained a single, severe sentence. December 7th. The day will come when we will be unable to pay for shipping and other items with cash. Roosevelt had actually already made the decision to assist. He had just won a record-breaking third term as President of the United States. They assured Americans that their nation would not go to war. However, he thought that without American assistance, Hitler could not be stopped. Now he devised a means of accomplishing these conflicting objectives. He would provide funding and equipment to the British so they could battle and prevent the Nazis from entering the United States. Roosevelt delivered his great idea to the American people on December 29, 1940. We must be democracy's greatest weapon. This exigency is as serious to us as the actual war. Our resolve to support Great Britain will not be slowed down. The capitals of Europe were rocked by Roosevelt's address. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda in Berlin, felt the shift. December 29, 1940. The United States is becoming more and more enmeshed in war psychosis. Will Roosevelt, however, really declare war? This was the very question Churchill was currently asking himself in London, and he started to harbor an illusion that would cause him a tremendous deal of grief and disappointment. I shall carry out my duties as President of the United States with integrity. After taking office in January 1941, Roosevelt's first action was to introduce the legislation that would later be known as Land Lease Aid. For Churchill, it was the beginning of a deliberate and unavoidable path to war. The new American measure, which gives the president broad authority to help us in every way, has delighted the Prime Minister. He claims that this is equivalent to the U.S. declaring war. Roosevelt's stated objectives were further revealed in private. The president's closest political ally, Harry Hopkins, had just arrived in Britain and provided Churchill with a clear guarantee. I've been sent here by the president to assure you that he will do everything in his power to see you through. As long as he has human power, he will do everything. Churchill was aware that the president could only request a declaration of war under the U.S. Constitution. It required approval from Congress. The majority of Americans wanted to assist in the war in Europe, but a vociferous minority preferred to stay out of it. John Colville was informed by Churchill. The president's audacity is the crucial component. He will set the example rather than follow it. Although he opposes war, he will not back down from it. Wendell Willkie, the Republican presidential candidate who lost, was another American who traveled to London and offered even more encouragement. Churchill received a handwritten note from Roosevelt from Willkie. This verse, in my opinion, is as applicable to your people as it is to us. O ship of state, continue to sail. Continue to sail, O Union vast and powerful, with all of its anxieties and aspirations for the future. Humanity is breathlessly waiting to see what will happen to you. For Churchill, it was clear that the president was getting ready to fight beside him. Roosevelt, however, questioned Willkie about Churchill right away as he got back to Washington. Is he a drunk? After 10 months, Roosevelt was still making various noises to different individuals, and the hidden suspicions persisted. Despite Roosevelt's outward charm and affability, Churchill was still unaware of how elusive and impenetrable the president truly was, and that nothing he said could be accepted at face value. Henry Stimson, the American War Secretary at the time, talked about how hard it was to bring Roosevelt to heel. He is full of anecdotes and experiences and jumps around in his discussions from proposal to suggestion, which is quite similar to following a stray beam of sunlight around an empty room. His mind does not readily follow a sequential line of thinking. Roosevelt's lack of commitment and clarity, however, was a purposeful ruse, sometimes to conceal his true objectives and other times to keep his options open. He was also dishonest in his bonhomie. Eleanor, Roosevelt's wife, would later caution Churchill. Franklin's yes doesn't indicate agreement. Rather, it indicates that he is paying attention. However, Churchill was still only partially aware of this and could only act based on what he heard and observed. That was still encouraging. The Lend-Lease Bill was passed by Congress in March 1941. Roosevelt gave a rousing address in response. Tanks, weapons, ammo, and various supplies are all necessary for the British people. They will receive ammunition, weapons, tanks, and various equipment from America. Lord Halifax, the recently appointed British ambassador to Washington, was among the attendees. He believed that Roosevelt's statements could only mean one thing. March 16, 1941. The head of a state that is not at war has undoubtedly never given a statement like that without inciting conflict. However, those who knew Roosevelt the best realized that he was deceiving Churchill. Henry Morgenthau, his Treasury Secretary, wrote in his journal after a private discussion with him that, "I could be wrong, but I don't believe the president is planning to take any drastic measures to aid England right now." Roosevelt's willingness to go further was put to the test in an instant. Only if supplies were transported over the Atlantic safely could Lend-Lease succeed. In private, Salmon Roosevelt received pressure from his cabinet to permit American ships to organize armed convoys. They were rejected by Roosevelt. April 2, 1941. Public opinion, according to the president, was not yet prepared for the United States to convoy ships. In any case, he seemed to be hesitating and not prepared to move forward with full-scale help for England. It wasn't the mindset of a guy who meant to provide a clear direction for his people. Rather, it was the first indication of reversal. However, the timing of Churchill's arrival could not have been worse. The conflict was about to go grim for him. Hitler's army destroyed Greece and Yugoslavia in April. The Germans appeared to be unbeatable. The British Eighth Army was being driven out of Libya by Rommel. In the Atlantic, the number of U-boats affecting British shipping was increasing. Additionally, a number of his highest-ranking cabinet officials believed that Roosevelt was reversing his pledge to back the British. April 21, 1941. Everyone seemed rather disheartened by the war news and the president's apparent lack of leadership on the issue. In my opinion, I warned him that he needed to take the initiative. Roosevelt took one action. He made it possible for the U.S. Air Force and Navy to patrol farther out into the western Atlantic. However, this was of little use against Hitler, who now controlled most of Europe and was posing a threat to the entire Middle East and India beyond, and it only provided a little further protection to the maritime lines between Britain and America. Churchill begged Roosevelt for additional assistance in halting the Nazis. There is a lot at stake right now. Hitler might now quickly and affordably get a lot of benefits, in my opinion. Furthermore, we are so involved that there is little to nothing we can do to prevent him from spreading. Churchill was astonished by Roosevelt's response. The president didn't seem to understand his fuss. For my part, I am not depressed about Germany gaining more vast lands. All of them combined have very little raw material, insufficient to sustain or make up for massive occupation forces. Churchill found a terrible reality in Roosevelt's statement. It demonstrated the president's blatant disregard for the Middle East, seeing it as a component of an antiquated empire that he would rather the British abandon. He was interested in supplying Britain to prevent Hitler from entering America. Churchill visited the bombed city of Plymouth the following day, May 2nd. He was keeping his chin up in public. However, Roosevelt's warning and Hitler's devastation had brought him to his knees. May 2nd, 1941, Friday. In a cable to the president, the prime minister, looking more depressed than I have ever seen him, painted a grim picture of what a Middle East collapse might mean. He then drew a picture of a world where Hitler controlled all of Europe, Asia, and Africa, leaving the U.S. and the rest of the globe with little choice but to make an unwelcome peace. Churchill begged Roosevelt to save him in a desperate situation. "Mr. President, if the United States were to instantly align itself with us as a belligerent state, it would be the only clear counterweight I can think of." Churchill was starting almost a year after he was elected prime minister, groveling before Roosevelt, pleading with him to join the battle and threatening to do so if he didn't. All his aspirations were being dashed by the evasiveness of the man he had placed all his trust in. Winston Churchill was at his lowest point in May 1941. President Roosevelt appeared to be allowing him to deteriorate. Anthony Eden, his foreign secretary, was minuted by him. "In my opinion, there has been a significant downturn on the other side of the Atlantic, and we are unwittingly being left to fend for ourselves." Churchill was hardly alone in his pessimism. A number of Roosevelt's top cabinet officials in Washington were furious at the president's seeming inaction. Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, arranged a confidential meeting with Henry Stimson, the War Secretary, Bob Jackson, the Attorney General, and Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, on May 12, 1941. According to Ickes' notebook, "I had convened this meeting to gauge the men's willingness to participate in a written submission to the President. We all discovered that we were in total agreement. We were all unable to explain the President's lack of leadership." 2 days later, Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary and another senior cabinet member, wrote in his notebook that he had met with Roosevelt's closest friend, Harry Hopkins. According to Hopkins, "The President has never said it in so many words, but he believes that the President is reluctant to start this conflict and would prefer to follow rather than lead public opinion." Roosevelt seemed to be experiencing a mental crisis at this crucial time. He spent a large portion of May 1941 in bed and hardly visited the office due to pressure from the hawks in his cabinet and the small but outspoken minority of isolationists on one side. He wasn't physically sick, though he did have a slight cold. "What he's suffering from most of all is a case of sheer exasperation," said Marguerite Lahand, his personal secretary, when one of the staff members asked him what was wrong. Churchill's sense of tyranny could only have been exacerbated by his increasingly desperate cables. "No matter what, you can be confident that we will continue to fight and that we can at least save ourselves. However, what use does that serve?" Things were becoming worse throughout the war. The Germans were driving the British out of Crete after capturing Greece and Yugoslavia. Roosevelt appeared to toss down the gauntlet to Hitler once more on May 27th, when he declared an unrestricted national emergency. "We all know without a doubt that the Nazi weapons of mass devastation will reach the Western Hemisphere if the rise of Hitlerism is not halted immediately." Harold Ickes and other skeptics in Roosevelt's cabinet, however, only regarded it as slick rhetoric. His remarks lacked any lift. He did proclaim a complete emergency at the very end. However, it is meaningless to proclaim a complete emergency without taking any action to implement it. Joseph Goebbels eagerly analyzed Roosevelt's address in Berlin. "We'll have to wait to find out what he does. At any rate, there is now no discussion of war. He doesn't dare right now." Adolf Hitler, Goebbels' employer, absolved Roosevelt of responsibility 9 days later. 3 million Nazi soldiers entered Russia before dawn on June 22, 1941. There was a great sigh of relief from Churchill. June 22, 1941, a Sunday. As she went to bed, the Prime Minister repeatedly praised Russia for opposing Germany when she could have easily joined her. Churchill said that the invasion demonstrated Hitler's aspirations for world dominance more than ever before and could only force Roosevelt to approach conflict. Roosevelt, however, came to a more nuanced conclusion. He made the rapid calculation that Russia's coerced involvement into the conflict might support America's decision to remain neutral. Alternatively, Russia might be the second country to receive funding to combat Germany. Roosevelt wrote to Admiral William Leahy, one of his closest friends, "Europe will be freed from Nazi rule thanks to the Russian diversion. However, I don't believe that we should be concerned about the potential for Russian dominance. Following his mental breakdown in May, Roosevelt experienced an abrupt sense of freedom. He immediately sprang into action, urging his administration to take action and requesting that Congress grant Stalin all of his demands without any conditions. "I'm tired of hearing that the Russians are going to get this and they're going to get that," he added. "I merely want to hear that it's already in progress." The majority of his shot was aimed at Stimson, who appeared to be in great misery. The president emphasized in his tirade today that we had to give the Russians the weapons, even if it means removing them from our soldiers. And it made me feel awful. He refused to listen to arguments because he was genuinely in a hoity-toity mood. Stimson was unaware that Roosevelt had no interest in stealing weapons from American soldiers. He didn't want or intend for them to fight. With American-supplied weapons, that was the responsibility of Russian and British troops. The president's invitation to come across the Atlantic for a face-to-face encounter had strengthened Churchill's conviction that the events in Russia would push Roosevelt closer to war. Churchill had told Queen Elizabeth before he set off, "Unless he had some other plan in mind, I doubt our friend would have asked me to travel so far for what must be a conference of global significance." Excited, Churchill arrived in Placentia Bay, off the coast of Newfoundland. On August 9, 1941, Roosevelt was waiting with the help of his son, Elliot. According to Elliot's description of their first meal together, Churchill jumped at the chance to address the president directly. Churchill reclined in his seat. He kept his cigar at a jaunty angle as he slid it from cheek to cheek. For a while, a persistent tone of entreaty pervaded his speech. "You must enter next to us. I advise declaring war without waiting for them to deliver the initial blow if you haven't already. They'll hit it when we've passed out. If you want to live, you have to enter." The two men were intent on moving forward. However, one topic threatened to ruin the good time on the second night: empire. In its hard lease negotiations, the Americans had demanded that Britain relax trade restrictions with the British Empire in exchange. That dispute, according to Elliot Roosevelt, erupted in Placentia Bay. The kettle started to bubble up and almost over a couple of times. Churchill squatted forward as his neck turned scarlet. "Mr. President, England has no intention of relinquishing its preferred standing among the British dominions. Under the guidelines set by England's ministers, the trade that has made the country great will continue. You see, Father, there's probably going to be some conflict between you, Winston, and myself somewhere in here." The dispute was amicable for the time being, and Churchill departed Placentia Bay with a positive outlook. When Churchill returned to London, he told his cabinet that Roosevelt had stated that he would actively search for an incident that would enable him to enlist America in the war. The president has stated that he will grow increasingly provocative and that he will fight war without declaring it. Roosevelt, meanwhile, was interpreting the Placentia Bay summit in a quite different way in Washington. "There has been an interchange of views. That's all," he told reporters. "The nation is no closer to going to war." Roosevelt's remarks were just another heartbreaking letdown for Churchill. "There has been a wave of depression here due to the president's numerous assurances about no commitments and no closer to war, etc.," he cabled Harry Hopkins, the president's closest political associate. Churchill's only hope was for the kind of thing he said Roosevelt had discussed in secret. 2 American destroyers were sunk by German U-boats in the Atlantic in the ensuing weeks. In his harshest response to yet, Roosevelt ultimately consented to let American battleships accompany merchant shipping in the Atlantic. You don't wait for a rattlesnake to hit before crushing him when you see him about to do so. Then, more than 100 crew members perished on the USS Reuben James, a 3rd American destroyer that was sunk. Churchill expressed his sympathies to Roosevelt. However, nothing more was done as a result of this most fatal episode. Roosevelt didn't even sever ties with Germany diplomatically. Once more, there had been talk but no action to go to war. It was time for Churchill to concede that dragging in America had not worked. The question of what game Roosevelt had been playing all along was raised by his evasive actions during the preceding 18 months. The president himself kept his cards so close to the vest that he never revealed to any family member, friend, or co-worker whether he had ever planned to carry out Churchill's wishes and enlist America in the fight against Hitler. The mental jigsaw can be put together, though. We'll offer a force to the adversaries. Churchill was encouraged to continue fighting by Roosevelt's statements and pledges, some of which were false or overstated. I'm here because the president wants you to know that he will support you no matter what. He financed and equipped Britain and later Russia with American funds and industrial might. We must be democracy's greatest weapon. Additionally, he was prepared to defend the Atlantic with the U.S. Air Force and Navy. This culminated in one of the most ingenious self-serving political maneuvers ever. Roosevelt was fighting Hitler and protecting America. Almost no American lives are lost in pursuit of his two main goals. In addition, he sparked a huge surge in armaments manufacturing that ultimately lifted the U.S. out of its economic slump. It will never be clear whether Roosevelt meant all of this on purpose or if it was the product of his vacillating in the face of events. The overwhelming weight of the evidence points to Roosevelt never having the smallest intention of granting Churchill's one and only wish, which was an American declaration of war. Churchill's lofty aspirations had not materialized. Almost nothing had changed, not even Lend-Lease. In its lonesome year of 1941, it supplied just 1% of Britain's armaments. The Japanese Navy then launched an attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Roosevelt was violently thrown into combat. There has been a state of war between the Japanese Empire and the United States. Roosevelt has yet to request that Congress declare war on Germany, Japan's ally. In the end, he was spared the option. Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days later. Churchill and Roosevelt's friendship was about to change. It would be a double-edged sword for Churchill. Churchill quickly set ship for Washington to join his new fighting buddy after Pearl Harbor. Their relationship had been freed by events. Churchill determined that the best method to solidify it was by physical proximity. Occasionally, to the extent of Churchillian eccentricity, as noted by Lord Halifax, the British envoy to Washington, 4th of January, 1942. Winston has been doing a fantastic job and working like a beaver here. He has a very close relationship with the president, who comes to see him in his bedroom at any time and is, as Winston claims, the only head of state he has ever met in the nude. On top of everything else, he's a fantastic showman. Finally, Roosevelt was able to make fun of Churchill's seduction tactics. It is pleasant to be in the same decade as you, he informed him at the conclusion of his visit. Those close to Roosevelt, such as Francis Perkins, his labor secretary, saw a new steel in his spirit beneath the smiles. He had transformed into a stronger, more committed individual. He was unique. He became cleaner, simpler, and more focused as a result of the horrific shock of Pearl Harbor, the loss of his priceless ships, and the unknowable dangers that war may bring to the populace. Roosevelt's friendship with Churchill would be significantly impacted by this transformation. Their honeymoon lasted until 1942, when the war was still going terribly. However, it was not and would not endure. Churchill ultimately lost the confrontation with Roosevelt. He was not convinced to include America in the conflict. Hitler and Japan did that. This meant that Roosevelt was fighting his own war, not Churchill's. Furthermore, the two men's long-term goals were completely different. Churchill's primary goal, which Roosevelt opposed, was to maintain the British Empire even after Hitler was defeated. And their first serious disagreement was about empire. Churchill had permitted talks with Indian nationalists to proceed in the spring of 1942, primarily to secure India's wartime allegiance. Roosevelt placed the responsibility on Churchill when the negotiations failed. Nearly everyone in this area believes that the British government's refusal to provide the Indians the right to self-government is what has led to the impasse. Sincerely, I feel compelled to bring this matter before you, and I am confident that you will comprehend my motivations. What Churchill perceived as Roosevelt's interference in his affairs infuriated him. One witness claimed that the tirade of profanity continued for 2 hours into the night. He wrote an angry response. "Receiving your mail worries me a lot, because I am certain that I cannot be held accountable for a policy that would completely confuse the Indian subcontinent as the Japanese invader approaches its borders." Churchill ultimately sat on the message. However, he informed Roosevelt that if he was pushed too far, he would quit over India. Then a second gap opened up between them. Poland's independence and the freedom of Europe were the reasons Britain had gone to war. However, as 1942 progressed, Churchill started to perceive a fresh danger to Europe: Joseph Stalin, the man who would turn out to be the third ally in the struggle against Hitler. It would be an unimaginable catastrophe if Russian savagery were to supplant the historic European states, he informed his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. Roosevelt had a very different perspective. He believed that the war had started because of internal strife among the old imperialist countries of Europe, and he started to regard Stalin as someone who could assist him in purging that imperialism from the planet. In 1942, he also said, "The European people will just have to put up with Russian dominance in the hope that the European influence will make the Russians less barbarous in 10 or 20 years." These divergent opinions sowed the seeds of escalating hostilities. Churchill and Stalin would face up in the third warlord duel. Europe's future freedom was on the line. The trust that Churchill had so diligently cultivated with his new ally across the Atlantic would be the victim of that duel.